Greetings adventurers, and welcome to the Loot Goblin Marketplace. Sometimes when it comes to covering RPG horror stories, it's easy to say that you'd quit the game within the first session and avoid the drama altogether, but remember, usually the stories we see online are accounts where they make sure to highlight the red flags and then hit you with the horrific climax. Those moments may have been few and far between during the campaign and even take place over the course of months when you look at the full picture. With the right group of friends, you may be able to laugh off the bat from one or two problem players because you're having a blast otherwise.
Stay safe out there, gamers. You never know when you might find yourself in an RPG horror story.
Today's treasure actually is a multi-parter that goes by the name The Epic of Steve, and to shake it up a little bit, I'm going to start with part 4, The Dragon Debate. In today's story, the Dungeon Master attempts to run a campaign using all of the Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 edition books, alongside any other system the players wanted, and it was a disaster. Too bad they didn't have today's sponsor to make a campaign that integrates a variety of class features, feats, and equipment with ease. That's right, today's video is brought to you by Apotheosis, a fantasy role-playing game where it's your actions, not your class, that determines how you level up. Apotheosis features a classless character creation system, meaning you get to shape your character the way you want. Build any playstyle you can imagine, no limits. Want to be a wizard with a gun, an orc with psychic powers, even an insect that crawls into creatures' minds and controls their body? All easy to make with Apotheosis' unique character creation system and playable species. The progression system in Apotheosis ensures that your character is fully customizable, with it being intentionally modular to allow for easy homebrewing and expansion. You'll find very quickly, if you're familiar with a D20 system like Dungeons & Dragons, that you can easily port over your favorite feats and items from your previous campaigns. And instead of hit points, Apotheosis has a unique evasion system that allows characters to move and react dynamically to opponents, making combat more realistic, cinematic, and immersive. Plus, Apotheosis offers a free character creation app for Android devices. It's ad-free, microtransaction-free, and always free to use. Plus, there's a free-to-join Discord community for fans, connect with fellow players, share stories, and get tips from the pros. Visit apotheosisrpg.com for more information and buy a digital copy of the game using the link in the description to get 20% off the core rulebooks, be it sci-fi or fantasy, and dive into the world of Apotheosis today. Before I begin this tale, I want to make it clear that Steve is not entirely at fault here. Granted, he should have stopped this about 5 minutes in, but this falls mostly on the shoulders of Mick and Pete. Mick was a political science major, and yes, the exact kind of poli-sci major you're imagining, the type who thought the height of economics is Reaganomics and that poor people just aren't trying enough. Pete was on the opposite end of the spectrum, but I knew it was a good idea not to bring up politics at the gaming table. In this specific campaign, we are all basically playing ourselves, with Mick being a bard and Pete being a druid. The debate began on the astral plane. For some reason, we found an ancient black dragon skeleton coiled around a mostly destroyed clutch of eggs. One egg was left and Pete quickly wrapped it up and said that he was going to raise it to be a pet for the party. Since we all trusted in his animal handling and didn't know anything about dragons in character, we agreed. All of us except for Mick. Mick asked if he could roll a knowledge nature check about black dragons. Given that he was a bard, he scored high on the check, and Steve said he basically knew everything about them. Mick then stated that we should crush the eggs because black dragons are inherently evil. Quick aside here, if this happened in one of my games nowadays, I would have quashed this because evil isn't genetic. That's even in the rules for 5th edition, but in 3.5, monsters didn't say usually lawful evil or whatever, it just said alignment lawful evil. This is what Mick was basing his argument on. Cue the start of back and forth between Pete and Mick about nature versus nurture when it comes to the alignment of monsters. The rest of us try to interject, but one side would start it up again a few seconds later. Turning to Steve, he simply smiled and let it continue. He never got involved in party conflict unless fists were able to fly. Quickly, the argument turned from being strictly about alignment and turned into a proxy war of jabs at each other's philosophical worldviews. No one else at the table wanted to listen to this, but no one could force them to shut up. Neither of them wanted to leave things be either, as the other party members could see that as admitting defeat. No one else wanted to leave either because it was our one bi-weekly session that we could make, and we were technically making progress, just with this argument going on in the background. Now comes in the horror part of this story. This argument that was an intellectual equivalent of Ben Shapiro and Mao Zedong arguing over their political beliefs of Elmo, yes, the puppet itself, lasted the entire 3-hour session. You know what got accomplished? Nothing. Pete still had the egg, and the party's stance hadn't changed. Mick only lasted one more session, saying that his character felt unsafe with the dragon and left. Steve never clarified the argument of the dragon either, as the campaign ended a few sessions later before the egg could hatch. Dungeon Masters, if your player starts arguing over the nature and ethics of monsters, step in and stop it. Trust me, no one wants to listen to the Bill Nye versus Kevin Hovind debate while trying to play D&D. And I definitely agree with the sentiment of the author, although I really want to know how Elmo got brought up into this situation. I really hope one of them was arguing that he's a force of pure chaotic evil. But obviously this wasn't one of those friendly debates, this was full-on anger of ideology. And that's something that's really hard to have at the table, where you know two people are very opposed to each other's worldviews and they have a bad habit of injecting their personal politics into the game. Now, as a dungeon master, you know, in a session 0, you can set it up where you might say that there are some geopolitical stuff in game that your party has to interact with. None of them are directly a real world equivalent, even though you might take away some personal inspiration. I mean, for example, in everyone's homebrew world, there might be one civilization that has an army that does vaguely resemble the Roman Empire and their legionnaires, but that doesn't mean that every single political point that the Romans believed are the same as the homebrew factions. And if you're the kind of person who cannot truly take the dungeon master in good faith and says, no, you're trying to do this real world equivalent and I disagree with you, I feel like it might be time to take a step back. Remember, it is a role-playing game, and if everyone has to adhere to your personal worldviews one-to-one in-game, as in real life, you are not a good role player. When it comes to discussing the alignment, I think that's a little more interesting. Ultimately, as a dungeon master, you have final say. It doesn't matter what edition you're playing and what the default of that edition is. If you want to play a campaign where every goblin is chaotic, just tell the party, hey, in my world, goblins are going to be always chaotic. There's a very important homebrew reason. This setting, it's always consistent. I'm not trying to trick you. This species is just always going to be chaotic. Just let them know, and I think most people are going to say, okay, fair enough. I don't usually do it that way, but I'll keep that in mind and just play the game. So story 1's down and a complete flop on Steve's part. Let's see what happens in story 2, The Legend of the Greyjoy Spoonman. For those following the Epic of Steve, you may be wondering why I was even playing with Steve at this point. Honestly, my friends and I kept going to sessions because we found them hilarious, like in the way that a toddler babbling about a tea party is funny. Here be a tale of the one time I played in a Game of Thrones campaign. I can't remember the system exactly. It also doesn't end poorly, as it's more the story of a dungeon master getting his just desserts. This was prior to the explosion that was the TV show, so Steve was responsible for bringing us into the world. This included giving us pre-made characters that would fit in the world, and I ended up with a Greyjoy. The first session went by fine, with our party being brought into King's Landing after being selected by each of our houses to represent them at an event. The second session is where things go south. Turns out the event was a tournament to the death. The Targaryen noble didn't have to participate because, well, she's a noblewoman, but everyone else was expected to participate in the death matches. As a maester, I had the combat ability of a blind kitten, so I asked what I could do that didn't involve me dying in a round. Steve tried to insist on me participating because I was risking extreme dishonor, but I replied with, I'd rather be dishonored than dead. After glaring, he finally agreed to let me have a stall on the pavilion to demonstrate my skills, but I would only have 2 silver left after paying the fees. It was also basically just a tent, chair, and a table. I would have to supply my own things to sell. During the remainder of the session, I was basically treated like I wasn't there. Steve doesn't even engage with me, so I drain my phone looking at dank memes. I show up to the next session and more of the same. I brought it up to Steve and he just said, you should have been in the tournament. I hatched a plan in my head to at least make the session enjoyable for me in my head. Me, hey Steve, before we go on to the next fight, can I clear up a couple things about what I'm doing? Steve, yeah, I guess. Me, so I can make anything in the player handbook while I'm at my stall, right? Steve, if you can afford it, but you have to check if you can even buy supplies here, which you probably won't be able to. Me, okay, but if I already have the stuff, I can make it, right? Steve, sure, whatever. Anything else? Me, will anyone buy anything for my stand? Steve, roll for it. I roll high on my salesmanship. People will buy whatever you have, but only at the listed cost. Me, that works for me. During the rest of the session, I was again ignored, but I hatched a plan. In the handbook, there was a description of things you could craft, what materials you needed, how long it took, and how much it sold for. Turns out that a spoon weighed slightly less than a piece of silver. I guess they have tiny teaspoons. All I would need for it was my tools because it was so low of a check to make a spoon that I couldn't fail. Additionally, a feature of my class was the ability to make masterwork items. They cost the same amount of material and time, but sold for 200% of their normal cost. Finally, the time to craft a spoon was only about half an hour, so I could make a few in the 10-hour days I was being left alone for. So for the next 8 in-game days, of which I was entirely ignored, I sat in my stall hammering silver coal coins into masterwork spoons. I ended up making 150 spoons and selling every single one of them. Everyone who was anyone in King's Landing had a custom spoon in their pocket, and I had a ton of extra money. When the tournament was finally over, Steve asked me to fill in the party on what I'd been doing. He lost his mind. He said that I'd undermined the entire campaign, but the other players quickly reminded him that I asked him if I could do it and that I followed the rules the entire time. Without a leg to stand on, he grumbled about it and had the guards seize all my silver as a tax on my stall. Our barbarian who won the tournament split his winnings with me after we left the city gates. After hearing of what I was doing, the noble in our party, who is also incredibly bored of the forced sidelining that Steve imposed on her as well, bestowed upon me the title of Spoonman of the Iron Throne. The look on Steve's face whenever he was reminded to have his NPCs call me by my full title was worth 3 sessions of being ignored. Honestly, that's a beautiful way to handle a difficult dungeon master. Correct me if I'm wrong for thinking this, but if the noble sat out and the barbarian and the maester was supposed to go into the tournament of death, does that mean that one of them had to kill each other at some point to win the tournament? And if they had additional party members, did the barbarian have to kill additional party members to get to the end of this tournament? Because if the dungeon master said, hey, it's okay, there's going to be a reason why your character's spared, it's more of like a gladiator combat thing where you can choose to have the person live or die, then at least they would go in feeling like it's not hopeless. But yeah, if there's a barbarian in your party and only one of the party members are going to come out alive in that tournament, I would wonder why I'm playing this campaign too, because it wasn't a one shot, it had at least 3 sessions, and it went on after the tournament of death. So I'm really confused what Steve was trying to do here, and that's one of those things where communication really would have solved this issue. But man, this guy made the most of the story. The rest of the party members instantly jumped on and had his back. I totally get the argument that maybe the spoon crafting is not rules as intended, but it is rules as written. And when you made the guy sit through 3 sessions and not do anything fun, I think having this little story is a great payoff. And truth be told, if there's too much gold circulating in the world, you can always scale up prices. Just let Spoonman of the Iron Throne have his little victory. This is a perfect example of if the Dungeon Master just had the same humor that the party did. This is a non-issue. This shouldn't even be part of a horror story. But now I'm starting to understand why Steve is a little difficult. So let's move on to the third and what I think is probably the funniest of this storyline that goes by the name Don't Try and Date Your Wife. Old Grandpa Carl is back with another tale from the Epic of Steve. This time we're going to look at how being in a relationship in the real world doesn't automatically transfer over to RPGs. We're also going to see how dense someone can be when they're being told no. Nothing overtly sexual or anything here, but there is some discussions of sexual harassment, so take that into account here. This tale takes place during an extremely short-lived section of the epic that took place in space. We were all enlisted members of some space navy, with Steve having an NPC as the captain of our ship. The only other person of note here is Carmen, Steve's wife. She was playing an engineer and her persona was very stereotypical, it's not a phase mom, cyberpunk character. Steve's captain was Zap Brannigan from Futurama, but no, he was just Zap Brannigan. From the first session, Steve started hitting on Carmen's character hard. He basically acted like their characters were married in game, but Carmen wasn't having any of that. Carmen in real life was bisexual and she wanted to explore that with her character, so in her backstory she wrote that she was a lesbian. Steve, or his character, I'm honestly not sure which, thought that his charisma could overcome her lesbianness and that they could be a couple in game. Carmen obviously wasn't happy, but she decided to just try and roleplay out of it. As a quick side note, Steve's continual pursuit of his own wife basically left us to our own devices. The majority of 4 to 5 sessions we had were just looking neat things up in the vast array of 3.5 books, while Steve verbally drooled over his wife. It had kind of been normalized that Steve would ignore people that didn't fit his narrative at this point in the epic, so we just made sure to pay attention to the story and the crazy stuff. At first, it was just simply turning Steve down like a normal person, politely but firmly, and getting less polite as time went on. Then she stepped it up by finding a girlfriend on the ship, moving all the stuff into her quarters, and essentially spending all of her time with them. Steve still wouldn't get it and kept asking her to come up to his room, so she escalated. At a meeting that Steve's character was running, Carmen loudly interrupted and said, "In case no one has noticed, I'm making out with my girlfriend in the corner." We all laughed, but Steve just didn't seem to get it and continued on with the meeting. Finally, after a couple weeks of in-game pushing, Carmen decided to do one of the most amazing feats of boss bitchery I've yet to come across. She had asked our communication person, Pete from the previous stories, to reroute the entire fleet's communication array to a portable camera she owned. She set it up in her girlfriend's quarter and began a long scripted speech about how much of a lesbian she was and how nothing was going to change her for about 15 uninterrupted minutes. We weren't going to stop this, and Steve Steve seemed to want to hear this too for some reason. She described everything about her girlfriend that she loved and how she was the complete opposite of Steve's captain. She also decided to read this from her diary that she started keeping about every single time Steve had tried to sway her from her orientation. She then capped it off by proposing to her girlfriend on camera. Steve's character was humiliated. His character was, but not Steve himself. He claimed that he had planned it all along, and the repeated sexual harassment and pressure from the superior officer was meant to push Carmen into being comfortable with herself. It was just a coincidence that he shut down that wing of the campaign immediately after the speech and hated us talking about it when he was around. The weirdest thing for me about this, Steve and Carmen are still married. Okay, yeah, what's going on here? Is the DM sitting in a cuck chair just letting it all happen? I just scroll up and double check this. He describes Steve's character as an NPC, so he is dungeon mastering this game, which means everything that Carmen does he has to approve of as the dungeon master. I'm sure there's a couple things she probably even rolled on. He said, yeah, you pass. Go live your lesbian fantasy, honey. And everyone just kind of had to sit there. At least it was funny enough where they enjoyed it. But the fact that they're still married and the fact that it went on so long uninterrupted, I feel like you guys just kind of sat through some ERP. You know, this might get an award for being the tamest instance of a player getting harassed sexually by the dungeon master, but that doesn't make it any less confusing. Overall, I guess no one was harmed and it was a pretty funny read, so let's just move on to Epic of Steve, Origins and the Accountant Story. Steve, not his real name, was an infamous dungeon master in my university gaming group. His infamy came from two things: describing everything in the most minute detail, like he was trying to outdo the word count of Lord of the Rings in every session, and for the most ambitious campaign I have ever participated in. Now I'm sure you've heard of No Limits campaigns. Campaigns where you can use any book in a game's library for your character and whatnot. Back in 3.5 when the Epic took place, that meant a lot of books. I think the hard drive my friends and I were using had 200 gigabytes of books on it. For Steve, that wasn't enough. Not only could you use any 3.5 book, you could use any RPG system you wanted. Heck, you could even combine them. You want a big eyes, small mouth background character with 3.5 warlock levels and equipment from GURPS? Sure, Steve could make that work. A truly limitless character creation seems like it would be ambitious enough, but Steve took it up one step beyond. Because we were all in university, we often didn't have schedules that matched up, although Steve always seemed to have time. Normally, that would mean a small party or a large gap between the sessions. Steve had another idea. Players could have sessions whenever they have time, even if it was just them and him. On top of this, there was no limits on the number of players, with the campaign growing to about 24 people, all having sessions at different times and with different groups. Finally, the cherry on top of all this, every action was in the same universe regardless of the time period. Some players played a D20 modern campaign, and Steve made them the descendants of some of his fantasy characters. Actions that the historical players took affected quests in subtle ways in the space opera TTRPG. This didn't just cover his campaign either. Players were in other campaigns too, and Steve would routinely try to force other campaigns' stories into his. Needless to say, this was a nightmare for players. There were some times when players were paralyzed with the choice because they were worried about it affecting something else somewhere, and breaking an unseen chain of events, only for it to have changed because of a game the day before that they weren't involved in. Some of us, though, had fun with it. Yeah, that sounds crazy. Pete, a reoccurring character from this saga, was upset with things happening in his campaign that were caused by a time-traveling campaign that was happening. Yes, Steve allowed interdimensional travel between campaigns. So, after his character was arrested by the time cops for something that his 34th generation grandson did, and had to sit in prison for a few sessions, asked to play another character in a one-on-one session just to bide his time. Using D20 Modern, Pete rolled up a CRA, which is a Canadian version of the IRS, accountant. He wanted to play during a tax time and launched an investigation into the time cops' income and taxes. To his credit, Steve played a 3-hour session doing it, but it ended up costing the time cops $50,000 in back taxes. As you can see, as much as Steve can be weird and difficult at times, it does seem like the man really enjoys playing TTRPGs, and he really enjoys getting everyone involved every way he can. It seems like he has a lot of free time, and he spends it all in the hobby. And based on what I'm reading, a lot of his campaigns kind of ended up being chaotic train wrecks, but in a very entertaining way. He might do one or two things that annoy the party. He might not be the best mitigator when it comes to politics and other things at the table, well, but man, every time this guy's about to take an L, he kind of rolls with it. In one story, he tries to hit on his wife. The wife's character wants to play someone who's into girls, and even though he could shut it down, he kind of just lets it happen. The spoon thing kind of caught him by surprise. The Game of Thrones campaign was very, loosely planned out, it seems like, thought-wise. But hey, every time one of the party members said, oh yeah, by the way, Steve, you gotta call the guy by his title, he has the NPC do it. So in some ways, he's like a good sport. It's not all bad. But then you have the instances where he's like, hey, I don't know what to do with your character because I planned one thing specifically and you're not playing into it. So now you basically get ignored for the entire session. For someone who essentially lets people play one-on-ones all the time, that kind of strikes me as someone who is not very good at improvising, and there might not even be a ton of malice to it either. So I felt like reading this Origins at the end kind of gives a more interesting perspective in who Steve is as a character, and just how I could see someone totally wanting to sign up for this crazy ride. So there are a couple other stories in this epic. The second and third one I thought wasn't that important to include. Basically, it was situations where it's a new campaign because he keeps rolling campaigns pretty much every week, it looks like. A party member wants to do something and he says, no, not allowing it. I can see why this guy isn't the best dungeon master, but even in my day, I've had a bad ruling or two, I feel like, looking back at it. And some of it might have been because I was trying to shut something down for a cool moment to happen. For most people, they make those mistakes early on, like I did. If you continue to make those mistakes, you have a bit of an ego and you feel like your storytelling is more important than player agency. I feel like you have to do a lot wrong to end up in an epic. Every dungeon master usually improves a little bit over time, and usually you don't end up an epic on RPG horror stories unless you're really bad and the party stuck around for too long. This is the first one I read though where I'm like, I kind of see that it's funny more times than not, even when it is bad. I could see why people stuck this out for so long. So as much as Steve might not be the best dungeon master, I don't think any of us are. So I really enjoyed reading this series because it is kind of this unique blend of a bunch of bad instances, but also a bunch of unintentionally funny moments that offset it. You're not going to have a perfect campaign session over session, so just keep in mind, just because one thing goes south in your campaign, it doesn't mean you have to run to RPG horror stories. But if you do and it's especially spicy, I might cover it on the channel. So I really want to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments, especially about if I'm underplaying how bad this dungeon master was. Maybe I'm going too easy on him, I don't know. Make sure to like and share the video to help it grow, and I'm really glad that you guys are enjoying the stories. I hope to see you guys in the next video. Farewell for now.